the area of the pons, or the area of the brainstem that's been damaged, is at or below the junction with cranial nerve 5, okay? That's the trigeminal nerve. And what that means is that the operations of the cranial nerves above cranial nerve 5 are preserved. So what's above cranial nerve 5? Well, a couple of afferent nerves, the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, are spared, but also two efferent nerves, the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve is also spared, so that these patients are able to hear what's going on or see what's going on, and they're also able to engage in voluntary eye movements when they're not able to engage in anything else. So this is how you get locked in, by getting damage in this area of the brainstem below, at or below the junction with the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so let's look for a second at how things go with the persistent vegetative state. Typically, a persistent vegetative state can become permanent, and in fact, that's what happens more often than not. A person may move from a coma into the vegetative state, but it persists so long that it is, for all intents and purposes, permanent. You can recover from the persistent vegetative state. There are examples of it happening, and it turns out that you can predict the ability of the person to recover by looking at his or her responses to stimulation during the persistent vegetative state as well. The more you get differential responding of any particular kind, the more likely it is that the patient is going to recover. But again, these recoveries occur relatively rarely. Okay, the persistent vegetative state is really more just a vegetative state. Nevertheless, these patients often get physical therapy so that their muscles don't atrophy in case they're able to recover. They also may get electrical stimulation in the brainstem area in the hopes of promoting the recovery of whatever the tissue might have been spared by the damage. And also in nursing homes for these individuals, you'll often get cognitive stimulation. The families or healthcare workers are encouraged to interact, to talk to the patients, to read them from the newspaper, read them stories or whatever. It's not clear what effect this has, except perhaps to bond the families and the caregivers to the patient, but that in itself is no mean thing. As I say, recovery from the persistent vegetative state is rare, but it does happen. Here's a case that occurred about a decade ago. That's the last one I know of around here. A woman in Tustin who had been in a coma for about a year. And then at one point, family happened to be in the room. All of a sudden, she turned toward her mother and smiled and all that. She had gone into a coma essentially during childbirth. There had been an accident during the birth process. And she's been followed up. She's now able to lift her arms a little bit and hold her child. But still, her movement is very, 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 very limited in terms of both voluntary movements and communication. This is a case of recovery from the persistent vegetative state, but we want to make it clear that most of these patients, when they do recover, A, recovery is very rare, and B, recovery is very, very, very limited. That's just the way that goes. Here's the data, again, from an old study that's still the same. Chances of recovery in the persistent vegetative state are greatest within about 6 months. Now remember, this is about 41, 42% of patients in the vegetative state. But we saw in a previous graph that the likelihood of going into the vegetative state from a coma is only about 10%. So you're looking at half of 10%, or about 5% of patients. If they're in the vegetative state for more than 6 months, the likelihood of recovery is very, very, very slim indeed. You had a question? Somebody here.
I was just wondering, how is it
This is vegetative state, not locked in. Okay, that's the point. She was able to recover that much. She couldn't during the vegetative state, okay? But she's recovered. Now, how these recoveries happen is not clear. The likelihood of new neuron growth is, of course, very limited. But in this case, some of the damage must have been incomplete. So eventually, she just got the recovery. But again, this happens very, very, very rarely. Here's another famous case. Some of you may remember this. The case of Terry Schiavo, who suffered a cardiac arrest and went into a vegetative state in 1990. 8 years later, her husband petitioned to have life supports removed. These vegetative patients, their hearts are beating and they're breathing on their own, but they have to get nutrition and they have to get fluids delivered to them. He wanted to remove the feeding tube and just kind of let her die. The parents didn't want that to happen. There was a huge to-do about this case. Very interesting history where the federal government got involved. There was a special law passed to prevent her feeding tube from being removed and all of that. Eventually, she died, did die eventually, and on autopsy was revealed that really there was no brain tissue there. It was just intracranial fluid. So again, these are very, very, very heart-wrenching cases. They're very, very, very difficult cases to deal with, both for the families and for medical personnel. It's a good thing they happen as seldom as they do, but when they happen, they can be very, very, very difficult. All the more difficult because we have yet a third condition now that we have to deal with, which is known as the minimally conscious state. These are typically patients who have been diagnosed in the vegetative state, but who show partial or inconsistent recovery of consciousness. Again, much more than what you typically get in the typical vegetative patient. Here, the patient may be able to communicate with people from the outside, but this communication is very inconsistent. It's not easy to make sense of, but they may try to speak, may try to make various kinds of gestures. They also show occasional responses to stimulation, greater responses than you see in the typical vegetative state. They will localize auditory stimuli. They can fixate on a moving object. If you pinch an arm, they will look at where the pinch is, or they'll withdraw the arm. They can, on occasion, reach for an object. If you hold out a cup, they'll reach for it, and they'll actually shape their fingers so that they can grasp the cup. And there will be some contingent emotional responses. Again, smiling and crying. But this happens intermittently, okay? So that it's as if the patient really doesn't have a lot of consciousness, though the patients have some. This is a new diagnosis. This was first named only in 2005, and is something that you see references to now in emergency rooms, in hospices, and in nursing homes quite a bit. Here's a pioneering study of brain activity in 2 patients in the minimally conscious state, one with damage to the left the temporal lobe, which makes life interesting. In this case, they recorded the brain activity while the patients were stimulated with, say, light touch on the hands, or a familiar voice told them a story about a familiar event or whatever. And the patient's responses to this were recorded. And what you can see here, what's interesting in these 2 patients, patient A and B, these are controls. When you touch their hands lightly, you get a lot of activation in a part of the somatosensory cortex known as the hand area. That is, where representing the hand. in these two patients, you can also see activation in those same areas, which seem to confirm the fact that there is some kind of the sensation going on. Same patients, the response to verbal stimulation, you get activation of the language centers here in the temporal lobe. You've seen some activation. This is a difficult test. Remember, one of these patients had damage in the left temporal lobe. It hit the Wernicke's area, so you're going to have problems with language anyway. But these patients did seem to be able to discriminate speech from non-speech stimuli and so on, all of which went to kind of confirm the idea that at least these patients are to some extent minimally conscious of what's going on around them. Here's a graph of the brain activity here, looking at the whole brain, just the left temporal lobe, the right temporal lobe, in response to presentation of forward speech. And what you can see is that one of these patients was responding quite a bit, almost as much as the controls, to the forward speech, but not responding to the backward speech. So there was a discriminative response to auditory stimulation, making a distinction between speech and non-speech. This first patient, who had a lot of damage to the left temporal lobe, you couldn't measure that at all. But again, with this second patient, patient 2, they were clearly making a discrimination that would ordinarily count as something that would require consciousness. Okay, here's a later example of patients who were diagnosed clinically as in the minimally conscious state, and here we recorded. The investigators recorded event-related potentials, so-called evoked the potential, to the patient's own names. There's a couple of components of the event-related potential that occur out here about 100 milliseconds after the stimulus, which are generally recognized as cognitive components. That is, responses to meaningful or unexpected kinds of stimuli. And if you're going to diagnose somebody as conscious, you really want to see activity out here after about 100 milliseconds. So here we have some patients in the persistent vegetative state, a couple of patients diagnosed as the minimally conscious state, some patients who are in the locked-in syndrome, where we know they're conscious, and patients who are age-matched controls. And what you can see here, looking at, this is a wave that occurs about 100 milliseconds after a stimulus, 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds. P3 is particularly interesting because it's a response to surprising kinds of stimuli. And what you're seeing here is at least some response in the vegetative patients, but not so much in the minimal, okay? Here, N2, you're getting about the same amount of response in all these patients. And then in P3, which is a response to an unexpected stimulus, again, you're at least seeing some activity, P3 activity, that's greater in the patients in the minimally conscious state compared to the patients in the vegetative state. Again, a physiological sign that suggests that these patients really are conscious after all. Here is another graph of this. Basically, the percentage of subjects who show this P3 response to an unexpected or anomalous stimulus, 100% of control.